we're going to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and that's privacy and security. Because we know that wherever the data lives is a target for people to attack it. And in the cloud, okay, leaky S3 buckets aside, I have much better security and governance controls when everything's in one place. That's why military bases exist. We can protect the things when there's some place where we can put guards around them. But if we distribute everything all over the place, I mean, think about some of the latest hacks that you've seen where we've been compromising people's remote devices. Think about Pegasus. If you don't remember Pegasus, it was a very crafty piece of spyware that was deployed almost exclusively to journalists and dissidents. Why? Well, because WhatsApp and Signal and Telegram messages are local on the device and encrypted there, and I can't steal them from somewhere else. So let's talk about the security and privacy impacts of this. And I have a couple of concrete examples, and I know that Bart does too, but which one of you tinfoil hat people want to jump in on this one before I do?
I will.
Okay.
You know, the security in the edge is no less important than the security everywhere else. You know, especially if a company's in a zero trust type of model.
But the delta between talking about security and getting to zero trust was less than 3 minutes. I want you to know that, but go ahead.
It only took one person. But, you know, and that's not to say that anybody's really fully doing zero trust, but that model of there is no edge, that everything is the edge, that there is no firewall, but everything has a firewall concept works very well in the edge, because you may have a single device out in the middle of nowhere, not directly connected to anything else that you want to be protecting. So there's no grouping of the protection there. So I think that's a good gateway drug into zero trust in a lot of ways, but it's also going to be much more successful protecting those edge devices if you take that approach of, you know, you have to assume that whatever is coming at you is already compromised, and you need to double check to make sure that it's the right thing, and you need to verify every time that something connects to it, that it is a valid thing to connect, and all those other principles of zero trust, making sure that that device that's sitting out there on an island by itself is truly protected, because there is valuable data in there. Otherwise, why would you have it out there?
That's a good point.
I think one of the biggest challenges to security when it comes to the edge is typically when you're accounting for security in a data center, you can somewhat safely assume that the attacker doesn't have direct physical access to that device. They can't just walk up to the rack of servers and plug a console cable in. And if they can, the old maxim is, if they have physical access, it's game over. I don't care how much, you know, security you've applied, you'll be able to get into that device at some point.
And Dad, I will actually quote an old Microsoft knowledge base article. Many years ago, someone submitted a request to Microsoft that said, if you put a Windows 2000 server CD into a Windows 2003 server, you can reboot the server and gain full admin access over the console and do whatever you want with it. And Microsoft's response in the Techno article was, if you don't have physical control over your servers, you don't own the server. And that was 20-something years ago that we've looked at that. But that was pre-cloud revolution, pre-edge revolution. So the concepts of security are becoming a lot more nebulous. And I can give you a really good example of that. Passkeys. It's a new technology that's been developed. Apple is utilizing them heavily in the newest version of iOS. They're actually using your edge device as a more secure method for authentication. You can use Face ID, Touch ID, your passcode on your device, that's something you physically own, to be your passkey system to get into eBay or any one of a number of other websites. They're saying, I trust you more because you have an edge device than I would with just a simple password system. And it's creating more of a zero trust boundary, because now I effectively have immediate two-factor authentication. And that could even go up more. I mean, in-factor authentication, right? So is edge helping us become more secure, even though we have to deal with the possibility that some of that technology buildup is going to expose us to more possible problems in the future? Gina?
This is nothing that we haven't done before, right? We have done this before. So the whole idea of having this concept of now we can do computing in the edge, which is just like in the cloud, all of these have, the cloud too had huge security holes and privacy holes before everybody pointed them out and people made lots of money filling those holes in. So if this is a concept of getting application data or an application running closer to where it needs to run to be performant, then part of the deployment has to be what data is available and how is it secured. And I know from Edgefield Day 1, we had lots of people come and say, oh yeah, this bricks, this is sitting, we know the teenagers are gonna try to rip this off because working in, wherever they are, Dunkin' Donuts. We know they're gonna try to take this in and turn it into their game server. It bricks as soon as it walks out the door. We just put another one in there and it's so small and cheap that's built into our product pricing. It's built into the whole thing. Anybody deploying it is also going to have that same mindset. Okay, this is a new way to deploy things and a new way to get things done. What do we have to look for? Who are the vendors we're working with, the hardware vendors, the application vendors? Do they understand what's the security problems of? I would almost go to say that okay, I'm going to put on this is my tinfoil hat that I'm putting on, that it's more about privacy than security. Because security is plain old, we can fix that. We're going to fix that and we're going to plug the holes just like we did in the cloud. Security is something different. So if that police car has in the police car, there's 2 laptops. One of them is plugged into an application that can take real-time data that they're scanning license plates inside their car, even though that may turn to be illegal or is partly illegal in lots and lots of states right now for that to happen. They can take that license plate data, access an application on-prem and put that in their car and put that license plate data along and have a match of what's actually going on with that person that drives that car. Sure, they might find a stolen car, but they also might find a way to track very specifically and instantaneously underprivileged residents of their city, which is something to be aware of from a privacy perspective.
And it's a governance issue because we run into these problems all the time. And Bart's raising his hand. So you have an interesting aspect of this, but I do have a question for you after you bring up this point because there's a little bit of a link here. So you go ahead.
Well, definitely, I can confirm that in Belgium today there is the discussion, but it is happening already. And in Europe we have GDPR, so there is a lot of visibility on privacy and it works effectively. But I can tell you today that with a police car, there's a camera based on the license plate. The only thing that they had to do is link databases.
Yes.
And so now they can see that car is insured, that it's tested, that it's technically okay to be on the road, which is another database, that person paid his taxes, personal, company taxes, other things that they had to pay. So by putting all the data together, indeed, they have a lot of power. And of course, there are now rejections on, is this allowed, yes or no? That's why we have GDPR. Some things are accepted, some others not. Talking about those cameras watching you or watching at least your license plate, until now, we'll see next year, but today, they blocked the fact that we're going to use those images from your car that we can see also inside your car that you're holding your smartphone in your hand, which is at least not allowed. And now the politicians, they said, nope, we're not going to do that because I can see the freckles on your arm with those images. And we don't want that for privacy reasons at that moment.
So see, I live in Texas and they're doing what they want to do. And one of the databases that they join with it are the social databases. So there are all sorts of law enforcement applications that they do what marketers do. And they go on and they're able to build profiles. And the whole idea of it is to find the bad guys. But lots and lots of times it gets a lot of good guys in the trap, right? At the same time, because they're not great yet, the facial recognition and all that. But if they can take a picture of your license plate, and yeah, of course they're going to have access to the governmental things, which is great and fine. We give out, that's part of being a citizen. But also can they tie it to a database that has all about your social life and things you might have said that you hate cops? And could it also be tied to the cell phone towers and the pings from your cell phones to see exactly where you are and where you're going? Like how far out from a privacy perspective is some of the edge technology?
And I think it's important that we have to be able to recognize that just because, as Stephen put in our previous segment, having access to the technology effectively creates this impetus to implement it. If we think about all the times that you've heard that someone developed a really cool new patent for something, right? And most consumers are like, okay, when's that going to be in my next smart device? Well, we've still got to figure out how to build it, how to make it efficient, how to make it cheap. But as soon as that technology comes out, we have those capabilities, people want it. But we have to put those guardrails in place. And GDPR is actually one of the best examples of a social guardrail to prevent technology overreach that I've ever seen. And even it doesn't go far enough because they're already starting to have to make additions to it to prevent the kinds of things that you're running into where it's like, well, I didn't collect that data. All I did was connect my data to somebody else's data. And the problem is that as edge compute devices become more and more powerful, we have to worry about what happens when more and more of that can be done on device where it exists outside of those guardrails. I mean, we were having this conversation this morning with Jim and I. We're talking about Wi-Fi. You may not think of access points as a Wi-Fi access point as an edge device. It's just a piece of networking equipment, right? Well, modern Wi-Fi access points actually do have decision-making capabilities, and it's enforced by the federal government in the United States. They are not allowed to operate outdoors in a specific spectrum band. And if they do want to operate outdoors, they're actually required to do a database lookup to decide if they're tromping on a satellite downlink frequency. And they have to scan on a regular basis to make sure that the airspace hasn't changed. That's a critical enforced capability by a government body. And we did that. Now, if you go to another country, I'm just going to pick one out of a hat, like, say, Saudi Arabia. That AFC coordination doesn't exist. And there's been testing. They actually did it in Saudi Arabia because there's a lot of desert. You're not going to knock down a satellite. And they were able to prove that, we can do this and it's this narrow and we don't have bleed over and everything like that. But then you come back to the US and you have the situation that arose with the FAA and the FCC, where it's like, sorry, you're not operating 5G or 6 gigahertz anywhere near my airports because there's a possibility that a 45-year-old plane radar could potentially be interfered with. And the solution was not, we'll upgrade your radars. It was, put a control in place to keep that from happening. And those are the kinds of technologies, honestly, that we're not even considering at the edge. We talk about hot, shiny, exciting new stuff, right? The edge is also the 50-year-old milling machine that's running on ArcNet if we're lucky. It's all of the expensive old equipment that needs to be modernized but can't be upgraded. Jim.
So one of the interesting stories that came out of Chicago recently was that due to climate change, the city of Chicago is slowly sinking. Most of downtown is actually not anchored to bedrock. We have a lot of landfill in
What
a
you
lot
get
of
when you
parts
build
of
a
the
city on a marsh.
Yeah. Well, so they had people walking through tunnels and various underground places looking for the sensors, all edge computing sensors, but they're having trouble finding them because they've placed them in so many places and they don't remember necessarily where they all are. And they're like, oh, well, that's a small problem. And my first thought is, how are we going to upgrade each one of those devices? I don't know what they are, right? Specifically, they could be a small Android device or something like that when there's a security vulnerability.
And that's a massive problem that we run into is we talk about the privacy implications, but how many of you have ever had to go deploy a massive patch quickly? Everyone has, right? Times 100, times 1,000.
Yeah.
What if it's an embedded OS that can't be upgraded? The Mirai botnet operates because those edge devices will never be upgraded. Intel had a huge problem with code a while back in their Atom processors, where after the CPU hit a certain number of run cycles, it just died. And it's not coming back. And you know what Intel's response was? Buy a new one.
Mhm.
So we're literally getting to the point now where the solution to security problems is chuck it out the door. Because effectively, the per device cost is not worth upgrading it. We're not going to burn dev cycles to keep that going, Bart.
And I think indeed that if we take a look, if I am a hacker, indeed, is that 20 years ago we still have stupid users doing funny things on their PCs, and then we train them to say, watch out with this and watch out with that. But now we have those millions and soon billions of connected devices. We cannot train them. It's the implementer or the manager of those devices that need to maintain those devices, update the devices, check for vulnerabilities. There are websites out there where you have all the IP addresses of all the smart home cameras from one specific brand that I'm not going to mention here. But you can see now directly with one click, you can see at the inside of all people everywhere in their living
Yes.
places, in their homes, without them knowing themselves that you can peek in their living. And we got to watch out because those images can be used as well. If I'm a thief, I can see, oh, they're not at home. So let's visit that home.
You should absolutely never go to shodan.io. You will not like it. Trust me. Cody.
This brings us down to edge as a service, because if we're going to do this sort of thing, we're going to basically deal with these thousands of devices that may be unmanageable soon.
Mm-hmm.
Edge as a service comes into play because we can hire some other organization to deploy and manage all of this stuff. And then when it becomes a big problem, it's their big problem.
Mm-hmm.
And
Definitely.
that's really attractive.
There's a massive amount of money involved in paying someone else to fix your problems.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, look
Welcome
back
to
to the IaaS to cloud thing, right? And one thing we saw from Edgefield day one was the vendors that were at the top, in my mind, were the vendors that had centralized orchestration. Like either they just physically could not be managed on site. You couldn't upgrade them with a port. They didn't have a port. Everything was back central in the cloud. Obviously, the connectivity needs to exist or it needs to come on the network at some point. But having that central orchestration is a must when you've got tens, 20s, hundreds of these things.
Brian?
At the risk of taking us back to the previous conversation, which I kind of wish we would have brought up at this point now, but we've been describing an IoT solution. And now, that the previous conversation we had is, I brought up the point about we've had edge computing for decades.
Yeah.
And IoT is an example of that. I mean, a lot of places we called it IoT because it was just a bunch of stuff out in the middle of nowhere randomly. So let's tie this to the security topic though, because we've been struggling with that. Like the security of IoT devices sucks. I mean, it's just not good. And all of these things around patching and protecting them and the fact that they're a physical device that somebody could walk up to and take or access directly or whatever that might be, we haven't figured that problem out yet. That's still a problem. So, that's a problem we got to get figured out. And maybe calling it edge will help us to get there. But that's a huge issue that we have right now.
But the other issue that we're going to run into, and Gina kind of brought it up, talking about one of the previous presenters at Edge Field Day, is every control that we put in place can be circumvented somehow.
Yep.
I'm gonna bring this up because as a former Field Day delegate and a good friend of mine, Bob McCouch. Bob, if you're watching, hey buddy. Bob's iPhone got stolen in Vegas this year.
Ooh.
He sat it down for 2 minutes and it walked away. And he was watching it walk away on Find My iPhone. You can't get into an iPhone now unless you have a face or fingerprint or passcode, right? Well, I can take the iPhone apart and I can sell the parts. Except Apple fixed that. Now the boards and the cameras and everything are all serialized. As long as your phone's listed as stolen, none of that stuff can ever be used in anything else again. So we're going back to the original, which is social engineering. Rest in peace, Kevin Mitnick. That I'm going to try to trick you into delisting your phone so that I can use those parts because the phone is useless to me, but the parts are not. And going back to what Gina said, yes, that thing that those teenagers stole out of Duncan is useless as a device, but the pieces inside of it may not be. And we could create an entirely different form of cybercrime by saying we're just going to enable the ability to cripple our edge on demand should it become necessary. I mean, how many times? Here's a good example of why this is a problem. Anybody in here use Disney Plus? Anybody in here ever tried to boot anyone off of your Disney Plus if they guessed your password? I'll give you a hint. For the first 8 months, it was impossible. You could change the passwords on Disney Plus, but you couldn't boot remote users off. Edge controls are more than just what you might think they need to be. If someone's logged into my Disney Plus, and whoever you are, you have really good taste. I just wish you weren't doing it on mine. When I finally was able to boot the guy off, it was because Disney pushed down a patch and said, oh, hey, we realize that there are some nefarious people in this world, very much Jafars and Maleficents who like to steal other people's stuff. And so are we going to get ourselves into a situation where the technology is going to outrun our ability to control it? Because we've already seen that. And Gina brought that up earlier with the idea of stingrays, which are the police scanners that allow you to basically collect a massive amount of data and sift through it later. We would never have done that if it was somebody who was having to literally look at every license plate on every car of the pictures that were taken. And now it can all just basically be processed through, well, normally through AI systems, but maybe that's what we've been doing with those CAPTCHAs all this time. But, you know, and these are the implications. And unfortunately, there's no technology solution to this. I'm sorry, this may be tech field day, this may be edge field day, but the answer is not going to be found in silicon. It's going to be found in wetware, in us. We're the ones that have to decide how far we want to take this technology.
Mhm.
So for every really cool tap to pay situation that you run into at Starbucks, you also have to worry about the fact that if you're not paying attention, someone can walk by you, tap their phone against your hip, and they might be able to get information with a poorly coded application or a very cleverly crafted application. And so we're going to have to spend more and more time not developing the tech, but developing the controls around it. But thankfully, we know that smart thinkers out there already have, like Isaac Asimov, because before a robot was ever built, he realized that robots needed controls. Don't do harm. Don't hurt, you know, do what's best for everyone else. And maybe we need to get back to that. Maybe we need to figure out that this, you know, this solution may give us the ability to create a police state, but is that what we really want to do? Technology for the sake of technology is useless without the ability to make it work for the good of all of us.
You're running right back to what we were talking about earlier, tying databases together.
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter of classification of data and who does the classification and who enforces the classification. And another piece that comes into it is to bring in the edge side of it is where does it get tied together?
Yeah.
Is there a copy of it made at the edge when that's where the things are tied together? Because classification also is a piece of it is context. So if you keep the data remote, I can keep the context and I can be watching people that are mixing things together that shouldn't be. But if it's out at a remote site, how do we put those controls in there?
And the thing is, this is a fascinating discussion that is much more nuanced than we can give it time in 25 or 30 minutes. And that's why it's so important that we have events like Edge Field Day, that we bring in the people who are manufacturing this equipment, writing this software, to answer the questions of the people who are deploying it and figuring out where that intersection needs to be and how clearly those lines are defined. And if it's not Edge Field Day, it needs to be podcasts like Utilizing Tech. It needs to be the ones that you guys are operating, because ultimately at the end of the day, unless the questions get asked, the answer will always be, and we don't want that.